And we left off in chapter 2. We've made it into at least the first 12 verses of Mark chapter 2. So I think let's just jump right into chapter 13, or verse 13 rather than do any real review. The only level set review I'll state up front, like I always do as a reminder, we're studying the life and ministry of Christ Jesus, and we're doing that simply because Jesus Christ is our best example and illustration of who God is, and he's our best example and illustration of who we are as children of God. So that's why we're deep diving into Mark. So I always like to remind everybody. So Mark chapter 2, verse 13. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him and he began to teach them. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. So remember, we pointed out, I think a couple weeks ago, Jesus wasn't just the carpenter's son, he was a rabbi. And so this is a rabbi moment. He's just called another disciple. And in this case, the first time when he called Peter and who was it? It was Simon and Philip. The fishermen disciples, we'll say, since I'm drawing a mental blank there. The first time, what's really clear is, so you've had the unlearned and uneducated fishermen that had already been passed over by the other rabbis. They've already missed the boat. They've already missed the opportunity to have been selected. And then Jesus says, well, here, follow me. You can be my disciple under my rabbinical ministry. And so here, there's an even more unlikely thing happening, because Levi, in case you don't realize it, they don't make it clear in this gospel, but it's clear in some of the other accounts, Levi is actually Matthew. So he's the apostle / disciple that is more affectionately, more popularly known as Matthew. And he was a tax collector. And during this time frame, the Jewish nation was under Roman rule. And so there was a set of taxes that were levied upon subject people within the Roman Empire. And the way they would levy, the way the Roman Empire, the way Caesar would levy these taxes on the subject nations, is they would typically actually use natives from the subject nation to be in charge of collecting the taxes at these like tolls, these booths, where people, it would be like commerce roads almost, like where people well-traveled locations. And so tax collectors were exceedingly unpopular in Jewish society. And there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, nobody likes to pay taxes. Number two, these guys were considered traitors to their nation, because essentially what they've done, and right or wrong, this is the perception. What they've done is they've taken up occupation through the Roman Empire, and they're actually living off of the way it was set up. They would collect taxes from the people, pay it to the Roman Empire, and then skim off the top to have their livelihood. And that was just that was their payment plan. And so the way that happened, though, was, at least in the common perception, was a very dubious and questionable mechanism. So there was constantly an accusation of dishonesty. There was constantly an accusation of unfairness. There was constantly an accusation like you've betrayed your people, and now you're basically stealing money from your people while you're doing them a disservice by serving our Roman overlords. And so tax collectors were just not amongst the most popular people during this time frame. So a rabbi, Jesus, selecting a tax collector who would be associated with a sinful, treacherous person was a completely unheard of thought. And then for Matthew or Levi to respond was also a pretty unheard of thought. So verse 15, while Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples. For there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." All right, so this is our first breakout moment here. Let's pause and get this. So a couple things when you're reading the Gospels, especially when you're reading the Synoptic Gospels. So Pastor Tari had said this, I think, quite aptly a few Sundays ago. But optic in the word synoptic, that means visual. It means your perception. Sin in the word is not sin like we think, oh, I missed the mark, I failed, I did something wrong. Sin in this case is actually like synonym, so similar. And so S-Y-N, not S-I-N. So similar view, similar optics, similar perception. And so whenever you're studying the Gospels, in particular the Synoptic Gospels, which is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's wisdom, I'll say, to cross-examine the parallel accounts contained throughout the Synoptic Gospels. So if we went to Matthew, I believe it's in chapter 9, if I'm remembering off. We're not going to actually turn there. The exact same account of Levi being called is in there, with a few slight word changes and a few slight detail adders and subtractors there. One of the additions is when Jesus says, when it says, look, he heard the accusation. Why does Jesus eat with tax collectors and sinners? Why is he hanging out in their house? Why is he having meals with them? Why is he acting like they're okay? Why is he behaving like this is acceptable, the tax collecting and the sinful people that he's associated? Why is he by proxy validating their lifestyle? That was kind of the accusation. And so on hearing this, verse 17, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick." And then in the Matthew version of the account, he quotes Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. And in that it says, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." And so Jesus says, go and learn this. He's like, look, it's not the healthy that need a doctor, but the sick. But you should go and study this out. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And then he makes the final statement, just like he does here in Mark, "I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." So there's lots of cool things to pull apart here. So let's take a moment. First of all, how many people here know that no one, there is no one who is righteous, not even one. All of them have fallen short of the glory of God. No one will be declared righteous according to the law. So it's super, you read through Romans chapter 3, it beats you right over the head with it. Like there was no righteous under the law. Contextually, they didn't have Romans chapter 3, obviously, that it wasn't written by the Apostle Paul yet. But what Jesus is kind of saying here in a subtle way is, look, I've come to reach out to those that are lost, the sick. I've come to help the sinner, not the righteous. Now, what the Pharisees in their piousness and their arrogance and their whatever, they considered themselves righteous. Hence the accusation. They considered themselves like they've got it done. They've arrived. And they are the kingdom, God-chosen, God-ordained people of that day. And so Jesus is like, well, I'm here for the sinner. Don't worry about it if you're so righteous. What's the big deal? Now, here's where it gets even deeper, though. And we will take a moment. Let's, if I can quickly find Hosea. Yeah, there it is. This is magnificent what Jesus has done here. So he tells them in the Matthew account, go and learn what it means, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. In the passage that he's quoting from Hosea chapter 6, right beforehand, if we start in the beginning of the chapter, in verse 1, come, let us return to the Lord. He has torn us to pieces. the Lord has torn us to pieces. This is an introspective, self-reflective moment for the Israelite people, the people of God at the time. Come, let us return to the Lord. He has torn us to pieces, but he will heal us. He has injured us, but he will bind up our wounds. Verse 2, after 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he will restore us, that we may live in his presence. Let us acknowledge the Lord. Let us press on to acknowledge him. And it goes on. And we're going to hit the verse 6 part. For I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings. But this passage is this backdoor Old Testament prophetic glimpse that's foreshadowing not just, well, most messianic, most prophecies that are from the Old Covenant looking towards the New Covenant. Many of them focus, rightfully so, on Jesus, the Messiah, and what he's going to do, what he's going to unfold and unveil. But occasionally, and this is one of those occasions, where you get a glimpse of, and this is what it means for the people of God. And so he's saying, look, you're included in the death of the Messiah. The Lord has torn us to pieces. He's injured us, but he will heal us. He'll restore us. He'll bind up our wounds that we may live in his presence. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he'll restore us. And so Jesus is actually, remember, at this stage of the game, he's not outwardly, in a very explicit, obvious way, making statements about his identity. They're sprinkled in a subtle, nuanced way in everything he's saying and doing. And so last week I pointed out the Son of Man terminology. More often than not, when Jesus is referring to himself out loud in conversation, he refers to himself as the Son of Man. And I remember as a new Christian, it was almost counterintuitive to me because I was like, well, why would you not just call yourself the Messiah or the Son of God or the Savior? Like, seems like that would be an easier designation for you to have adopted. So instead he uses the Son of Man, which almost to the untrained, immature thought process, you're like, well, isn't that the opposite of what you are, Jesus? Like, don't you know who you are? You're the Son of God. Like, that is your title that only you have. You're the only begotten Son of God. And at this point in time, he literally is the only Son because we haven't been included yet. There is no new covenant. And so I pointed out last week that the Son of Man terminology was once again this backdoor way of Jesus referencing his true identity while simultaneously illustrating the fact that he's operating as a human. And so most of the Son of Man references that are contained in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, they're actually there to highlight the person's humanity, their frailty, their liability to weakness and fleshly immortality. So Ezekiel, if you read Ezekiel, he's constantly referred to as the Son of Man. And it's not like a complimentary statement. It's an acknowledgement like, yeah, you're human. You're in the flesh. You're not an angel. You're not resurrected as a spirit. You're a human. You're a human. But then there's this one passage in Daniel 7 where the Son of Man term is used very distinctly and very clearly to refer to the Messiah, the anointed one that's going to bring forth this new covenant and bring salvation. And so Jesus was constantly, pulling this sort of scheme. I don't want to call it trickery because it's probably an unfair. It sounds like it's deceptive. It wasn't deceptive so much as it was, he who has ears, let him hear. That's where he was at right now. And so remember, part of the reason why he wasn't being so outward and explicit with his claims and even some of his actions, it's because everywhere he went, when people started to catch on, he could no longer publicly operate in that area. So he heals one person and all of a sudden throngs of people show up in the middle of the night at somebody's house. He takes authority over one demon in a synagogue and all of a sudden crowds of people are looking for freedom from demonic oppression. He heals a guy and says, look, go and give your offering to the priest and have them certify you as clean. You had leprosy, now you're clean. Have the priest, certify you. That's the law. Don't tell anybody. So instead, the guy tells everybody, and then he says, okay, now Jesus could no longer operate publicly, but he had to withdraw to lonely places. And so Jesus was constantly butting up against this issue where, because he was so dynamically manifesting God's supernatural kingdom expression and his will being made manifest in every situation in the most, outward and miraculous ways possible, he's constantly coming against this problem where he almost couldn't even get the message out properly because the people just wanted to see the next magic trick. And it wasn't that the people were wrong, like that's what the miracles were there for. But at some point, Jesus is like, yeah, you guys are here because I made 5 loaves feed 5,000 men, plus one. Like you guys are following me around to get your next free meal ticket. Like that's what this is right now. And so he starts giving a teaching on bread, the very thing that they're chasing after in the flesh. And he's like, look, I tell you the truth, unless you eat of my flesh and drink my blood, you have no part in me. And he ramps up to it. First he's like, well, I am the bread of life. I come from heaven. You've got to eat the bread. But then he just says, you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. And he's speaking metaphorically. He's speaking about a spiritual thing. You've got to be a participant in the body of Christ. You've got to be participant in the brokenness of that body and the outpouring of that blood. You've got to be a partaker of that. And you also have to be a partaker of the resurrection. And so he's just giving them a spiritual, statement about what the salvation experience for the Christian is all about. But they don't know that. So most of them leave. And, he looks around and the crowd's gone. And he's looking to his closest disciples. And he's like, aren't you guys going to leave too? And Peter says, where else are we going to get the words of life? You alone carry this. And so Peter's like, I don't know what you're talking about, man, but I know you've got God in you. I don't understand what you're talking. I really don't want to eat your flesh. I know that. I really don't want to drink your blood, but you're carrying something from God that I can't deny. You're carrying something from God that it cannot be explained. Where else can I go for the words of life? And so, you have to give him credit. You have to give the disciples credit. Like, they were overlooking a pretty hard thing. And there's something we said for that. I don't know how I got on here. This isn't even in Mark, obviously. But as a whole, the Christian disposition, the believer, needs to have a greater, I'll say, tenacity. We get offended too easily. Somebody says something that irks us or rubs us the wrong way. Maybe it's confusing. Maybe they're wrong. Maybe a teacher or a pastor or a leader or some other minister or whatever it may be, maybe they messed up and did the wrong thing or said the wrong thing. Yep. Have you ever made a mistake? And that's that's the kind of the new covenant thought process that Jesus is trying to illuminate. Now Jesus was perfect, so he couldn't say like, look, when I mess up, don't. But the point he's like, do as to others as you would want done under, like, love your neighbor as yourself. For this sums up the entire law and the prophets. But yeah, we as Christians, we tend to get offended a little too easily. It's a little too easy to walk away from, this person did the wrong thing, so I don't want to talk to them. I don't want to be around them. And, how many times in a day should I forgive my brother who sins against me? 7 times? And they think they're asking this question like, 7's a lot, right, Jesus? And he's like, no, how about like 70 times 7? And he's not actually trying to, like, don't do the math, it doesn't matter. Like, he's not trying to actually put a number out there. He's trying to say, no, there's no limit. Like, at what point does God stop forgiving us if we mess up? So how is it that it's, and that's the new covenant thought. So anyways, throwing out that one's just out there, I guess, not necessarily directly related to what we're reading in Mark. So verse 17, Mark chapter 2, on hearing this, Jesus said to them, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. you should go and learn what it means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Now, it's interesting. He says that. If you read the Matthew version of the account, he says it here, and he's actually going to say it again in a moment. So let's keep reading, and we'll explore it further then. So we're on verse 18. Now, John's disciples, John the Baptist. So John the Baptist, his disciples, and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, how is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not? So here it is again. The legalistic religious mind is trying to get its head wrapped around Jesus breaking the mold and his disciples following suit. Why are you eating with tax collectors and sinners? Why aren't you fasting? And John's disciples, John's a good dude, right? He's, I tell you the truth, among men born of women, no one greater has risen except, John the Baptist. But he's the least in the kingdom of God. The least of the person in the kingdom of God is greater than him, even though he's the greatest prophet that's ever lived in the old covenant. And so John's, for his moment and his context in this covenant, John knows what's up, and you have to imagine his disciples are they're non-trivial kingdom people. They're advocates for God. They're advocates for the life of God. And so now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, how is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not? Jesus answered, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he was with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. So some of this is pretty self-evident, but I think some of it probably isn't, so I'll try to hit the non-obvious parts. Number one, once again, if you jump into the Matthew version of this account, and I can't remember if it's Matthew 9 or 12. We're kind of covering back and forth here. Is it 9? Matthew 9? Okay. In there, they actually, and maybe I'll turn there since I'm quoting a lot out of Matthew. Let's actually go there. Matthew 9. Verse 15, how can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he is with them? The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, then they will fast. So here's something you need to know about Old Covenant fasting. It was not a happy occasion. You didn't do it because you had a feel-good hallelujah moment. Under the law, legally, as far as the letter of the law, when you were mandated to fast under the Old Covenant, once a year, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Many Jews still practice that to this day. And the idea of fasting during Yom Kippur is essentially you are atoning for, you're covering the last year's worth of sin. So it's not like, yeah, this is awesome. Yay for me and God. It's like, yep, I didn't always get it right. I know it. God knows it. This is a day of atonement. It's a solemn thing. It's a somber thing. And so he's equating fasting with mourning, rightfully so. And if you read in Isaiah chapter 58, it's, God is prophetically, through the prophet Isaiah, he's addressing the way the people of the day were fasting. And he's like, is this what a day of fasting looks like? You end up cursing each other out and beating your fists again, punching somebody in the face, and you're supposed to humble yourself in a day of fasting. You're actually part of it, and there was a practical element here. By not eating that day, you've now made more food available for people that are in need. That was part of the thought process for when people would fast in the Old Covenant. But humility and mourning, these more like lower somber thought process, like that was what fasting was about in the Old Covenant. And so he's like, how can the attendants of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom's there? You can't mourn for somebody that's with you. That doesn't make any sense. Now, another thing that's interesting, we think that weddings are over the top right now. I think they are. In 21st century America, I think weddings, they can get elaborate. I'll just leave it at that. And I know everybody's got their own opinion, so I'll try not to offend you with mine. But we think that weddings can get very extensive and elaborate in cost, in celebration, in numbers, of all kind, however you want to measure it. The wedding was the premier time of celebration during ancient Israeli times. When they had a wedding, not only would they have the party itself for the ceremony of wedding man and woman, they would have a week-long festivity it was basically the honeymoon. So all the friends and family would essentially, it's like a destination wedding, I guess, is probably the easiest way to equate. That was like the normal thing to do, a 1 week long destination wedding where everybody just hung out with the bride and groom for a week, feasting and celebrating and partying on their honeymoon. And so he's making this like illustrative statement here. He's equating himself to the bridegroom, and he's like, how can the attendants of the bridegroom be in a mournful, humbling, solemn state of fasting? They can't, because this is the moment of celebration. This is when things are good right now. And he's saying, look, the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. Then they will fast. Now, he later in the book of Luke, he references himself in a parable as a bridegroom, and there's a story of, I think it's 10 virgins, and 5 of them are wise and 5 of them are unwise, and the 5 that were unwise didn't bring oil for their lamp, and the 5 that were had oil, and so 5 of them were ready for the bridegroom's arrival, and 5 of them were not ready for the bridegroom's arrival. And once again, Jesus is equating himself to the bridegroom. One more thing out of the book of Luke, chapter 17. Verse 22, Luke 17, you don't have to go there if you haven't already done so, save you some time. Then he said to his disciples, Jesus said to his disciples, the time is coming when you will long to see one of the days of the Son of Man, but you will not see it. The time is coming when you will long to see one of the days of the Son of Man, but you will not see it. Men will tell you, there he is, or here he is. Do not go running after them. For the Son of Man in his day will be like lightning, which flashes and lights up the sky from one end to the other. But first he must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation. Okay. So, back to Mark chapter 2. Verse 20, but the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. So one point of clarification, he's not just talking about the 2 days in the grave. He's actually talking about a larger issue. He's talking about like, as the covenantal shift is occurring, so you're going to see this in a minute, and I don't have the time to go into full detail here, so I might have to elaborate on this next week. We'll just see. There's a covenantal shift that's about to happen. So they're in the old covenant right now. Jesus is going to, in the next couple years, die on the cross, be raised back to life, and then ascend into heaven. Thus opening the door for the new covenant. It's one little sticking point, though, that a lot of people don't realize or don't think about. The day that happened, while it's the day that the new covenant is now open, it's not the same day that the old covenant door is completely shut. There's an overlap. Why was there an overlap? Why didn't God just say, done, light switch, boom? Exactly, there's a whole nation of people that are covenant people, and they're actually just, a lot of them are in the Jerusalem area. But there's tons of them that are actually throughout now the whole known Roman world. So what God does is he has this dispensation of time where the new covenant has been unveiled and is on some level available to participate in. But the old covenant is happening in parallel. And then, in 70 AD, and so there's no way I'm going to cover all this, but I'll at least throw the thought out, and we'll go after more of it, in the coming weeks, we'll say. In 70 AD, what happens historically? Anybody know? So yeah, the Roman Empire surrounds Jerusalem, and they're stuck. There's this whole it's a walled city. And so the people in Jerusalem are stuck there for I don't know if it's months, it's a significant amount of time. Like they end up starving, some of them starve to death. Moms are eating their babies, like crazy, evil wickedness. They're desperate upon desperate. And the Roman Empire, which far outnumbers them and is, way more equipped to fight a war, they've got the whole city surrounded. And ultimately, they end up in the city, they burn down the temple, they destroy the temple, and that is the end of the Old Covenant age. Where am I getting all that from? Many a scripture. Matthew 24 is one of the clearest statements that just to throw it out there, Jesus' disciples they're walking by the temple, which is a monumental, glorious building. It was known for its splendor and spectacle, and it would actually, some of the extra biblical historical accounts, they would talk about how people who didn't know what it was, they'd see it because it's on this mountain. They'd see it and they'd be like, "What is that snow? Like what?" Because it was made, it's silver and all these fine gold and all this fine craftsmanship and then fancy materials, and so it would gleam in the sunlight, and they couldn't tell what was happening. And so it was one of these. It was a tremendous architectural achievement, especially for 2,000 plus years ago. And so his disciples say, "Look, Jesus, check it out. This is pretty cool, right?" And then Jesus is like, "Yeah. Not one stone's going to be left on top of another, though." And the disciples are like, "What?" And so you got to understand contextually, these guys think that they just found the anointed one, and they did, but the anointed one that's going to set up a physical earthly kingdom that's going to supplant the Roman Empire and restore the natural glory of Israel. And he's going to rule and reign physically in the Middle East, in Jerusalem. And so they're like, "Yeah, we can't wait until you show up with your armies and start killing these Roman, traitors and, cleaning up shop here." And so when he says, "No, not one stone's going to be left upon the other," they ask him this set of questions. They're like, "When is this going to happen? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Now, some of the older translations, I think, use the word world, end of the world. It's not world. If you look in the Greek, the term is drawing a blank. It's something like era-ish. It's like a time frame. It has nothing to do with global geography. It's a time dispensation. What will be the end of the age? And so what age? The Jewish age, the Old Covenant age, the law, the Mosaic age. And so he goes through this whole teaching, and a lot of it is apocalyptic language. Some of it is clear, just straight talk. Some of it is prophetic Old Testament throwbacks. You look at Daniel, you look at this, you look at the other. But the bottom line is, then he says towards the end of the teaching, this generation will not pass until they've seen these things happen. And so he's speaking, and it's about 30 some odd AD, the years early 30s AD when he says this. This generation will not pass until these things have been fulfilled. So in 70 AD, the temple's destroyed. The Old Covenant age the door is fully closed, and that dispensation is over. So yeah, huge amount of confusion, huge amount of debate, huge amount of controversy around everything I just said. So sorry if I confused you further or I'm happy to talk more about it, and we will go into it as it kind of comes up through through the book of Mark. But the bottom line is, and I'll finish here, the next passage here. It's going to make sense why I just said all that, hopefully. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. So in Luke 17, when he said, look, you're going to long for the days when I used to be with you. In that day, don't listen to them when they say, there he is, or here he is. He's warning his disciples, because they're like, yeah, right before this all goes down, people are going to start making claims like, oh yeah, Jesus is here, I saw him, or I'm actually the new Jesus. And you read in the book of Acts, like these guys would prop up and like show up and claim to be the Messiah. And they lead people astray. And he's like, no, don't get tricked by that. It's going to be like lightning. What's lightning like? Something that is encapsulating the larger domain and realm. It's not about an instantaneous, it happened right here and I can point at this person. It's going to change everything. It's going to light up the whole sky like that. And it's unexpected and it's sudden. So no one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, he pours new wine into new wineskins. So, okay, why is he talking about old clothing with a patch on it? Why is he talking about new wine and old wineskins and new wineskins? Like, what in the world is going on right now? He's talking about a covenantal shift. So he literally he's saying, look, these two covenants, the old covenant and the new covenant, they cannot coexist for any length of time. And, in the big scheme, it's 40 years or whatever it was, some odd year, it was a generation-ish. They can't just keep going together forever. One will destroy the other. One will supplant the other. And so, I guess we should go. Brian, my scripture reference man today, is it Luke 5 or is it Matthew 12, where he talks about this? It's the same passage about the unshrunk cloth and the Luke 6. All right, well, I'm closer to Matthew, so let me see if I've already turned towards that one. So let's see if I'm right, or we'll jump back to the other one if we need to. Is it Matthew 9? Yes, it is. But it's also in Luke. That's the problem when you have three different accounts. You got to find which one you want. So sorry, I should have written it down. So it's Luke 5. So let me, before I deep dive into Luke 5, which is it's the same explanation, just slightly more detailed and nuanced. He's given us two pictures. He's given us a picture of an old garment that has a hole in it, and it needs a patch. He's like, look, if you take this old garment that's already been used and washed and used and washed and used and washed, and then you take this brand new piece of fabric and you sew it onto it, what's going to happen? The old garment's already shrunk. It's already done its wear and tear, and it's already shrunk. The new patch will then, if it's stitched onto the old, it will shrink and it will cause a tear and it will break it. Wineskins. So back in the day, before they had bottle making facilities, they would store wine in goat skin or the leather of another animal. And what would happen is they'd pour the fresh, grape juice that's fermenting into a fresh wineskin, or fresh goat skin, or whatever it may have been. The grape juice continues to ferment, and in doing so, it's expanding because it's releasing oxygen. And so the leather has some give, so it kind of grows and expands with the fermentation. The only problem is if you take a wineskin that's already been expanded and you fill it with new wine that's not fully fermented, and then that new wine starts to ferment, it expands the leather that's already been expanded to the max, and it bursts, and you lose them both. So once again, it's old covenant and new covenant. The two couldn't coexist for any length of time. That you can get away with it for a little while, but it was never going to work for, a long play. So Luke chapter 5, no one tears a patch from a new garment and sews it on an old one. If he does, he will have torn the new garment, and the patch from the new will not match the old. So many things in the new covenant just don't match the legalism of the old. No one pours new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the new wine will burst the skins. The wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, new wine must be poured into new wineskins. And no one, after drinking old wine, wants the new, for he says the old is better. Now, this tripped me right up the first couple times I thought about it. Because I was like, wait a minute, how are you telling me that people think the old covenant's better than the new covenant? There's no way. Well, of course, to me, the guy who grew up with no Jewish reference at all, no old covenant reference at all. But what is human nature? If you lived your life in the old, and this is it, this is the end all be all, this is how you were trained, this is how you raised, your whole culture, your whole family, your whole legacy is in this. It's a bigger deal. And it's not even clear the way he says it, whether or not they've even tried the new or been exposed to the new. They just automatically, they're going into the old is better. What do you mean? What do you mean there's no sacrifice? What do you mean we're not under law anymore? What do you mean circumcision and uncircumcision has no value? What do you mean there's no special days or weeks or months or years? And if you read through the epistles and even the book of Acts, this is exactly what they came up against all the time. Read the book of Galatians. This is the story of what happened in the book of Galatians, where there's this wrestling match between the old and the new. And they're in this dispensation. The Bible, the New Testament Bible, was written during that, I'll call it, awkward phase, where the old covenant and the new covenant were running in parallel. It's a very interesting situation, because you've got the Old Testament mind colliding with the New Covenant revelation all the time. And it was so implanted in the society of that time and the thinking of that time, it was just a collision course constantly. Now we, in the New Covenant, so this is how cool God is. While we don't have the same exact wrestling match because we weren't raised in the Old Covenant, religion has become the new representation of the problem that was at hand. So the religious mind says you need to look a certain way, you need to act a certain way, you need to, walk a certain way. The new creation mind says, yeah, but really it's all about loving Christ. And whatever that looks like is a thumbs up. And over time, sure, you're going to see some of the old man behaviors flake off because the new creation doesn't have room for darkness when the light is shining. But it's not because of legalism, it's because of the grace of God. So it's interesting. Like all those scriptures, and I teach out of Galatians, more often than many of the books in the Bible. I've never pointed this out before, but technically the problem that they're facing, while it's so applicable to today's thinking because there's legalism and religious, they were facing it in a slightly different way because they had the old covenant and the new covenant happening at the same time. And there was that wrestling match because of that. So anyways, it's 8:16, and how many verses did we get through today? 2 verses? I intentionally did not say this up front, but I'll tell you what was in my head at least. I was certain we were going to be in chapter 3 by the end of today. And I was actually, to be honest, this afternoon I was a little nervous. I was like, wow, I've studied chapter 1 in depth. I've studied chapter 2 in depth. I've started looking at chapter 3, but not as deeply yet. Hope I can handle it. That was kind of the thought, and we didn't even get through chapter 2. So anyways, we'll close it out for tonight, and we'll pick up in verse 23 of chapter 2 next week. Thanks, everybody.